So, it's a long time before she makes it out to the U.S., but when she finally gets there, almost immediately, she writes a book. So this is almost unheard of for so many different reasons. Typically, I know we were discussing the Holocaust a little earlier. Well, typically with genocide survivors, they don't really open up immediately after the trauma. So even in the case of the Holocaust, it was a period of about 2 decades of almost virtual silence in the post-war kind of post-war memory. So same with the genocide, except it was even longer. So oftentimes survivors, especially if they went through, as harrowing of an experience as Aurora did, would not immediately upon landing in a new land go, okay, I'm going to write down everything. And she pretty much had almost no filter. If you read the memoir, I have a couple excerpts we'll get to, but I noticed that in her dedication right here, I don't know if anyone wants to volunteer to read it out loud.
I'll read it.
Thank you.
I'm good at reading. But I'll get a little closer.
Thank you so much.
Okay. To each mother and father in this beautiful land of the United States who has taught a daughter to believe in God, I dedicate my book. I saw my own mother's body, its life ebbed out, flung onto the desert because she had taught me that Jesus Christ was my Savior. I saw my father die in pain because he said to me, his little girl, trust in the Lord. His will be done. I saw thousands upon thousands of beloved daughters, of gentle mothers die under the whip, or the knife, or from the torture of hunger and thirst, or carried away into slavery because they would not renounce the glorious crown of their Christianity. God save me that I might bring to America a message from those of my people who are left. And every father and mother will understand.
Struck by this because it pretty much sets the tone for the entire memoir. And so there are a lot of questions that have been posed by different sort of scholars and artists afterwards who discovered Aurora as to what gave her this strength to do this. And I think we'll never really know, and I'm not even 100% convinced that it was only this. I think that very much so faith played an important role in Aurora's life, but I do think that it was, I think that this is a very beautiful way of touching upon some of the horrors that she went through and some of her, her resilience, but without getting too much into it. So I included a few excerpts here. They're not very long, but I would just like to kind of go through them to tie all these points together. So if someone wants to read this as
I'm still available if anybody, somebody else wants to read.
I'm not the best reader, but my story begins with Easter Sunday morning in April 1915. Standing before my looking glass, I was rearranging for the 100th time the blue ribbons with which I had dressed my hair. I must confess, a secret hope that they would be the envy of all the other girls at the church service. Lusan was making use of her elder sister's privilege to scold me heartily for my vanity. Lusan was always very prim and quiet. I was just about to tell her that she was only jealous because she soon would be a wife and forbidden to wear blue ribbons anymore, when my mother came into the room. She stopped just inside the door and leaned against the wall. She did not say a word, just looked at me.
So, thank you so much. So this chapter was titled When the Pasha Came to My House. It's the very beginning. So I love this for so many different reasons because we get a lot of detail here. So she says Easter Sunday morning, April 1915, was just about 3 weeks before the genocide. And so she begins by talking about how the blue ribbon in how she wants the other little girls in church to be jealous of her, and how her sister, right here, is telling her, oh, don't do that, that's not nice. And she's like, oh, well, she's only jealous because, you know, she's going to be a wife and she can't wear this. So it's like, it's so unbelievably, it's so innocent. And I love that, you know, contrast of what the dedication is like. It's almost like she seems like she's almost like this martyr, you know, for her faith, for her people, for this cause that's beyond her. And right immediately, like on the first page of the story, it's a completely different tone. And I find it so brilliant. And just a little bit later on, I swear this is the last excerpt that we're going to take from the book. But a little bit later on, she continues talking about this. So if I could just get one more volunteer, please.
Yeah, I'll just do it.
Thank you.
For a long time, the powerful, is it Hussein?
Hussein.
Hussein Pasha, who was very rich and a friend of the Sultan himself, had wanted me for his harem. He was no longer asking for me. He was demanding, I heard him say, soon orders from Constantinople will arrive. You Christian dogs are to be sent away. Not a man, woman, or child who denies Muhammad will be permitted to remain. When that time comes, there is no one to save you but me. Give me the girl, Aurora, and I will take all your family under my protection until the crisis is past. Refuse, and you know what you may expect.
Thank you. So this, in the last passage, when she says comes in, kind of, you know, the stone cold face, what's wrong? Well, this Pasha had been harassing the family for a while, but the family was very wealthy. They had no, they felt no reason to cave to his demands until 3 weeks before the genocide, when technically speaking, the genocide had already started at this point, at least in the villages, just not officially with the April 24th rounding up of the intellectuals. So it's not like they weren't aware that something bad was happening. So here, effectively, the Sultan is not telling this time, demanding to her father, give me your daughter, otherwise, look at what I'm going to do to you. So then the father's response, God's will shall be done, and he would never will that my child should sacrifice herself to save us. So he says this. Unfortunately, she does. And no one in Aurora's family survives. Not a single person. And I mean, this is poignant for so many reasons, but also when, and this didn't even occur to me until after I read this, but on the centennial of the genocide, the Armenian Church canonized the 1.5 million victims of the genocide. So effectively, in our church, all the people who perished during the genocide are considered saints. So it's almost ironic because Aurora survived. She's not technically included in that. So Aurora kind of made the ultimate sacrifice, but it's her family who we now consider as saints in our church. So I find that contrast also kind of ironic and powerful.
Yeah.
So all this to say, this is Aurora who wrote the memoir. Now, how do we get to, you know, this whole discussion of the film, Ravished Armenia? So I guess there are a couple major talking points. People love to talk about how this was the first Hollywood major film on the genocide. A lot of people think that was Ato Megoyan's Ararat, and Ato Megoyan even thought that too when he made his film, until he found out about Aurora. So it was a silent film made in 1919, so right the year after Aurora wrote her memoir. And one thing I neglected to mention was she wrote the memoir. Yes, part of it was this almost crusade to spread the message of what happened to her people and get you know, restitution and justice in some sense. But another part of it was because Aurora ended up in the United States through the help of an organization that's now come to be known as the Near East Relief. It's a foundation that still exists. And so they pretty much kind of, along with Hollywood, pressured her to star in this film. And later on, I'll talk about some of the horrible, ways in which they did that. So some things of note about this film: it was a smashing success, broke records, it was sold out in so many different cities. Wow. Aurora became like on par. She was a household name. But as I'll talk about that later on too, about why it's just sort of disappeared. But there's this one quote by filmmaker Eric Nazarian that I love so much, and he says, "The birth of cinema coincided with the genesis of the Armenian genocide." So this is another point to keep in mind that we'll go back to later on. And so just to get an idea of how big it was. Yeah, it says right here, the Stone Theater in Cleveland, one of the finest houses in the country, playing to a very high-class clientele. I love that. It's just like some, classist kind of latent messages there. And then Lowe's Metropolitan in Brooklyn, the biggest theater in the world, for the first time in its history, was unable to accommodate the crowds and turned away thousands, yes, thousands. That's a little bit ridiculous, but it was a big deal. But as I mentioned earlier, wasn't as nice as it all seemed. So Hollywood, Near East Relief, pretty much anyone and everyone who stood something to gain from this film took advantage of a young girl who was only 17, I guess 18 by this point. So there were many different things that they did. They lied to her and made her promises about things like, pretty much at one point they told her that your missing relative, I've heard different conflicting stories. One says it was her brother, another says it was her uncle, is in Los Angeles, so is in Fresno, so if you're gonna be shooting in Los Angeles, we'll help you get to be reunited with him. Another thing that is just really bad is during one of the scenes while filming, she broke her leg. Just don't think about how this has pretty much always been there and always been a part of this industry. So I think Aurora's character is, it can be studied in many different realms. And so this is another expression that is used for not just Aurora. I've heard the term thrown around before, but super survivor. And that can be interpreted in many different ways, but I think no matter which definition you use, I think Aurora is the archetypal super survivor. So I mentioned a little bit earlier that we don't have any surviving copies of this smashing success called Ravished Armenia. Well, yeah, as was typical of a lot of films, silent films, when Hollywood kind of made its way over to talking films, a lot of reels of silent films are just lost or destroyed. So, Ravished Armenia is one of them. There's about 20 minutes of footage that has survived, really terrible quality. You can watch it on YouTube. But even that, people have theorized that that's not the original recording. It's a recording of a recording. So I don't know, but so you can see a portion of it, but otherwise it's been lost. She did live to be quite elderly. Tomorrow is the anniversary of her death, which, 93 years old. She, what's interesting is after Ravished Armenia, and they were pretty much very quickly on, she kind of faded into obscurity. And so her personal life also very much mirrored, it was very depressing, let's say. So she was married and divorced. For the last few decades of her life, she didn't speak to her son. They had a very terrible relationship. So when she died, she spent the last years of her life in the Armenian cemetery in Los Angeles. She died in the hospital. The county took her ashes. So this county in Los Angeles has a policy where if no one claims the ashes within 4 years, then it's done. Like, we're just going to discard it in the main cemetery in, I think, Woodlawn. So that's what happened. No one claimed it. So today she's in an unmarked grave. No one knows. And even in her, you know, elderly age, like maybe about a couple decades before this, she would still speak to anyone who would listen. She never censored herself. There's footage of her, the Torosyan Institute at the time in the 70s and 80s. There was another genocide survivor, a gentleman who was going around and interviewing survivors. And you know, people talk, but still not all that many. But Aurora was one of those people, she had no filter. And it got her in a little bit of trouble too. There are some cute anecdotes where in Hollywood, because you know she was a big deal, she got to interact with all the big Hollywood stars at the time, and there's this story of when she met Charlie Chaplin, and she looks at him and she's like, oh, your hands are a lot smaller than I thought they were going to be. Because you know, she'd see him on this big screen and she thought, oh, so she still had this kind of naivete, but very authentic, you know, like character. So yeah, it's unfortunate that, you know, the film was lost, her fame was lost, but if you recall earlier when I alluded to that Eric Nazarian quote, the birth of cinema coincided with, you know, the genocide. Well, pretty much at the same time that all discussion of Aurora, her success, her fame, her film was lost, so too was the discussion internationally on the genocide. So I recall on Sunday, Greg, you had mentioned a really good point about how the film, the memoir and the film were both made in the middle of the genocide, right? Like the genocide was still going on. Like the official term, the official dates we give is 1915 and 1923. Well, that's a very interesting point too because, well, you know, by the time Aurora escaped and ended up in the United States, the first phase of the genocide was done. So really, by the time you get to the end of World War I, about end of 1917, 1918, the genocide as we know it, with the death marches, all the horrible things that go along with that, that was effectively over. And one thing that we don't talk about too much is there was this little window from that period, from about 1919 to really 1920, maybe 1921. It was a very, very small window of, we don't talk about this often, but in the Ottoman Empire, the Young Turks were actually, a lot of the high up leadership, including all three pashas, were sentenced to death in court tribunals in Ottoman Turkey at this time. So what ended up happening was it kind of went south, obviously. The leaders escaped, and then that's when you get the whole Operation Nemesis, that comes later. So, you know, we mentioned the Holocaust before, Nuremberg trials. I don't know if you've heard about that. Well, what's funny is, at this time, 3 decades prior, that was essentially like the predecessor of the Nuremberg trials. And Nuremberg trials are very famous today because, you know, it codified a lot of things, mainly that if you commit what we now consider war crimes, you cannot fall on the argument that my supervisor told me to do this. You're still liable. That was the genesis of human rights, different human rights conventions, the UN. So Armenians had this 3 decades before, and we don't talk about it. So in that context, so when I think about it that way, ravished Armenia could have only happened at that time. Ravished Armenia could not have happened in 1923 with the founding of the Turkish state. So it's almost like the parallels, you just can't ignore them. And so I have a little video here. I believe this is, think it is.
You could not.
Come on.
You could not.
Yeah.
Are you on a church Wi-Fi?
No, it's I've downloaded it into the presentation, so it should work. It's a very short clip.
Can you open the video for the 6?
Yeah.
Now won't they go? Huh?
Off there, yeah. Charlie Chaplin and Jackie Cooper. Charlie Chaplin.
So much work, yeah.
Charlie Chaplin is very,
They got video, yeah. I work from home.
Wonderful world we're doing. Great dictator. And he gave a speech
We went to the office at least for a day.
No, it wasn't sound.
Here we go. Okay. Technical difficulties.
one,
Sorry about that. So if any of you have tried to like YouTube or Google Aurora, you may have likely come across this one clip. It's just a minute and a half. And this is one of those testimonials that she's given. It's in English. It's a very short clip where she just talks about kind of her experience in the genocide. And I find it very fascinating for a couple different reasons. So we'll just play it and then we'll kind of talk about it.
Oh, wow.
Lily, can you enlarge it?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Thanks.
There it is. Just wait.
Lily C. Kirk Douglas died at
I just heard
130.
it. I heard it on my way over here.
It's paused.
I counted how many lights it took me to get here.
Emma, speed it up, уже. Speed it down dalej.
Honest.
You wanna go?
Yes.
Huh.
I love it. That's my Douglas. Yeah. Yeah, I know. Oh, why?
I looked it up yesterday, so I was like,
Oh my God.
this is the one I saw.
The other one is, why don't we, Lynn, what's your wife's name? Diane, why don't we put that in? I love that. That was like, she's watching me when I was outside in the kitchen. That was excellent. And then I said, Armenian moved.
They didn't take good care of them
Came
back
up,
then.
and it wasn't in Armenian. I think it was in Turkish.
Hollywood didn't take good
Is it
care
alright
of
if
its
I just
actors.
show it like here?
Yes.
Sorry about that, you guys. I don't know what's going on. But it's very short, so.
Oh, I hear something.
Mississippi anxiety abandoned children before reaching to death. Burn them.
Oh, you gotta make it louder.
That's his question.
The parish that where my mother was perished, and then they killed right before. I didn't see the body. I just found the body. I didn't see right before my eyes. But my two aunts.
For several different reasons. One, just, first of all, just having survivor testimony. I'm of that generation who never had the opportunity really to meet not only survivors, but one who would have experienced what she experienced at such an older age. But also the fact that, you know, she's talking about something very traumatic, something we cannot imagine. But and this is why I wanted to show it in full screen, because if you recall earlier, church, well, in this clip, she's wearing,
Yeah.
she's wearing a red ribbon.
Right.
And so not to read too much into it, but I mean on a very surface level, the difference between the colors, red is a color of intensity and passion and blood and sacrifice, and blue is calm and even keeled and like an ocean wave. And so it's almost like, I don't know how well you could see, but even though she was clearly elderly, graying hair, wrinkles, she still looked like a child.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm not a psychologist, but when she was, her body language, the way her voice kind of, the way she was almost like when she talked about when they would whip her. I mean, her voice just cracked like a child. You know, like when you say, oh, but he was hitting me.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, then it changes and gets super despondent, like, oh, they wanted to destroy all the Christians and get rid of us. And then she kind of catches herself and like laughs it off. You know, oh, I was a child, I didn't know. And then typical, you know, older Armenian grandparents, and they kind of just stare off and think, oh, you know, they kind of do the head wag. So it's like, you know, it's so, so many different, like contrasting kind of images that come into your head, where it's like you see every single thing that I had written there, the Aurora the child, Aurora the actress, Aurora the author, Aurora the survivor, every single thing there manifested in that moment. It was the actress, it was the child, it was just, you know, and it's very unfortunate that even in that testimonial and the other testimonials that she's given in English and in Armenian, it's obvious that the interviewer kind of has no idea who she is. Because she doesn't hide it, she mentions the fact, you know, she mentions things that she's written about and she's very vocal, but they don't press her on it because they've never heard of it. So it's like, what a wasted opportunity, right? That what we could have gotten out of her at that age, reflecting on the whole experience of going through that in Hollywood. And she's just a wealth right there. So the last part of my presentation, I mean, if the video is not working, I was just going to talk a little bit about her legacy and like how we even know about her today. They had alluded to the Aurora Prize. I guess I can kind of, I don't know if I should attach it, but this is an image from the Aurora Prize. You can see there are a lot of very famous people on here.
Do you want me to connect?
I guess I just have a couple more like images I can show.
Can we get it on the
Yeah.
screen?
He's gonna try.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because there's one more video, but essentially, the Aurora Prize was created after the centennial of the genocide by a group of very, very wealthy Armenian businessmen, and they have a lot of very diverse, amazing people on their board. So the whole gist of it is they award a prize of $1 million every year to a humanitarian who risks their lives for the betterment of others. And the idea is, they named it after Aurora, which is a very obvious kind of way of alluding to the genocide survivors and victims, but also playing on this notion that, well, Aurora's entire journey kind of was facilitated by the Near East Foundation. So, you know, on some level, all the survivors of the genocide were very much indebted to the non-Armenian humanitarians who helped. So the idea with the Aurora Prize is paying it forward and helping humanitarians today. So, yeah. And this is going to be a little video. We can try to see if it plays or not, but you can find it on phone. Wow, this all works! I'm not going to try to
Don't
press it.
Leave it alone.
So, this was a film. You'll catch it.
Armenia, the land of Noah. For millennia, Armenians created an ancient civilization of builders, healers, scientists, and storytellers at the crossroads of world cultures. They survived conquests and empires, contributed to trade, art, literature, and science, becoming a truly global people. In 1915, under the cover of the Great War, 1.5 million Armenians perished from their ancient homeland, along with their culture and way of life. This was a genocide perpetrated by the Ottoman Empire against its own citizens. Across the four corners of the globe, men, women, and children fled, seeking shelter and a life of peace. They were determined and resilient. The fortunate ones were saved by unsung heroes who risked their lives. Among the saved children was Aurora Mardiganian, an orphaned 17-year-old survivor of the atrocities. She became the star of Ravished Armenia, the first major motion picture produced in Hollywood about the genocide. Based on her autobiography, Aurora was cast in the starring role, reenacting the trauma of her young life and telling the story of her people. The film premiered to sold-out audiences in Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and more than 100 cities across the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and Australia. Aurora's autobiography sold several hundreds of thousands of copies. She became an international phenomenon during the silent film era, a symbol of survival, goodwill, and the devastation of the genocide. She was the icon of philanthropic aid for the survivors. In 1919, the monumental success of Ravished Armenia raised international awareness and $30 million for 60,000 orphans in the Near East. To this day, Aurora remains a testament to the living memory of the genocide and the gratitude of the Armenian people to their saviors. True to her name, Aurora became the symbol of light and hope for an entire generation. Those who survived and resisted the genocide, like Aurora, were scattered around the world and persevered. They rebuilt their lives and communities with dignity, ever grateful to the Samaritans who rescued their families. Men and women like Jacob Kunzler, Bodil Bjorn, Maria Jacobson, Fridtjof Nansen, and so many others put their lives at risk to heal and protect the refugees and survivors. The world today faces man-made disasters not unlike those of a century ago. Every day, heroes worldwide answer the call of human duty. These rare and brave men and women are among us. They are our neighbors. They are the strangers on the streets we pass. They work in the far corners of the world, saving lives with open hearts. On behalf of the survivors of the Armenian genocide, and in gratitude to their saviors, the Aurora Prize for Awakening Humanity honors the power of the human spirit that compels action in the face of adversity. Anyone, anywhere in the world is eligible for the prize. We salute those who dedicate their lives to enabling others to live and make a difference.
So yeah, that was a promotional video that premiered at the opening ceremony 4 years ago for the Aurora Prize. The voiceover was Eric Nazarian, filmmaker, and the music was composed by Sarah Stankin of System of a Down. So, yeah, I think it's one of the ways, I think probably the major way that her name has kind of come back to the fore. But there have been other ways. I mentioned earlier Otto Megoyan, the filmmaker, Bararat, his wife, Arsine Khanjan, is an actress. A few years ago, she wrote a play about Aurora. And actually, I believe the production was in Berlin originally, and there were German and even Turkish actors in the role. And they took it to Armenia a couple years ago. And she's the one who called Aurora a performer of memory, which I love, because that's essentially what she did in every way possible, from the book to the film. It's like, imagine if you've been through something traumatic and you're, it's like if you go to therapy and you reenact that trauma every day in front of cameras. And so that's essentially what Aurora did, but with a bunch of people kind of, suffocating her. And where she derived that strength, I don't know. But on a brighter note, 2 months ago, the Aznavour Foundation released these books, they're children's books. The one on the left is about Aurora, and the one on the right is about Charles Aznavour. So it's like a little instructional book in Armenian for little children to learn about Aurora in a very age-appropriate way. So I thought that was really nice. So that's kind of the end. I had some discussion questions. We can touch on those if we want, but if anyone has questions or comments, I'd love to hear them. So thank you. Technical difficulties aside.
My question is, I remember when I was little, they would say that the movie survived but was destroyed by Turks. Is any of that
Those are
true? They actually hunted for any kind of pieces of that movie and they intentionally destroyed it.
From what I heard, like I mentioned earlier, I can't confirm either way. From what I mentioned earlier, the next major project that engulfed Hollywood for about 7 decades that never ended up becoming made was a novel version of the book 40 Days in Musada. So the reason why that never happened, whereas Ravish Armenia did, was because at that point we saw